Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah. It is Friday. I hope you have a potentially fun weekend planned. I think it is supposed to rain here a bunch this weekend, which I am cool with. This is the rainy time in Northern California. We don't get a lot of rain, and it only rains just for really a couple months during the year, and this is that time. So as much rain as we can get without, it being dangerous, I am all for it. Why am I always talking about the weather? You ever notice that? Before we start on the episode and the interview with Reece Hirsch, who is my guest today, I just want to do a quick correction from the last episode. I said that Runner was the second book in Tracy Clark's Chicago Mystery Series, and it was actually the fourth. The book that we're talking about today is the second in a series of books, or a collection of books, a duology of books, what have you, featuring the main character. And so I think I just got my mysteries mixed up. Moving right along. As I said, I am speaking today with Reece Hirsch about his book, Dark Tomorrow. It is the second book that features FBI Special Agent Lisa Tanchik. And the description on the back of the book is as follows. How do you catch a terrorist who lives in cyberspace? FBI Special Agent Lisa Tanchik is skilled at handling cyber threats, having recently taken down a dark web black market worth billions. But ruthless hacker Natalia X always seems to be a step ahead. The government calls on Tanchik's expertise when an email attachment causes a fatal seizure at U.S. Cyber Command. But before she can get her feet under her, the entire East Coast goes dark. A sinister plan is unfolding before her eyes, and no one knows who's behind it. Tanchik plunges into chaos to hunt down the true source of the attacks. Close dealings with shadowy figures, both online and off, expose her to extraordinary danger as the country teeters on the brink of catastrophe. A soldier on the front line of a cyber war, Tanchik must nullify the threat before it deals a death blow to America's institutions and puts millions of lives in jeopardy. That is the description, as I said, of Dark Tomorrow by Reece Hirsch. It is the second novel featuring FBI Special Agent Lisa Tanchik. And if this book doesn't freak you out about cybersecurity, I don't know what will. It is definitely a thriller. It's crime fiction. You've got another strong female lead investigating a much different case from the last interview, which was a runaway teen. But this book is, as I said, it's cybersecurity, cyber terrorism, just a lot of scary cyber stuff, if you will. If you grew up, depending on your age, if you grew up watching Cyber Chase on PBS, this is not that. This is definitely darker than that. So let's go ahead and turn to the interview so that Reece can talk more about his book and the inspiration behind it.
This call is being recorded.
Hi, Reece. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Sarah. Nice to be here.
Nice to have you. We are going to talk about your new book, Dark Tomorrow. Before we get to the book, though, if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit about yourself so my listeners can get to know you.
Sure. I've written 6 thrillers, but when I'm not writing thrillers, I'm an attorney. I'm a partner in an international law firm and co-head of its privacy and cybersecurity practice. And that real world experience has colored a lot of what I write. A lot of the scary technology issues that I deal with in my day job, I bring to my thrillers. And prior to being a lawyer, I was a journalist, and I published and edited a arts and entertainment magazine in Atlanta for several years, which was a fun experience.
Yeah, I bet. Arts and entertainment to cybersecurity seems like an interesting jump.
Indeed, indeed.
One's a little more whimsical than the other. So, again, the book is called Dark Tomorrow. Can you give a brief overview of the story?
Sure. It features protagonist Lisa Tanchik, who's an FBI cyber crimes investigator, and she begins Dark Tomorrow by investigating a deadly email sent by a hacker. And you might ask, what is a deadly email? Well, it was based, that first chapter of Dark Tomorrow was based on a true incident involving the journalist Kurt Eichenwald, who was sent a harassing email that sought to exploit his epilepsy, because when you clicked on an attachment in that email, you were subjected to this blinding strobe light, which can induce an epileptic seizure in certain people, and in some cases can even cause death. And so, that event was sort of the initial impetus for the story. But Lisa Tanchik begins investigating this murder, and it turns out that it's just one piece of a much larger plot, because it's the first step in a larger cyber attack that's being committed against the U.S., because the person who's the victim of this email attachment works at U.S. Cyber Command, which is the agency that defends our nation against cyber threats. So she gets pulled into the world of Cyber Command and learns about, the defense of the nation in this attack, and she plays a role in helping to find the culprits behind it.
And this is your second novel featuring Lisa. What was your initial inspiration for the series or the duology or whatever you have planned for Lisa?
Right. Well, it started with the first book, Black Nowhere. And Black Nowhere was inspired by a real FBI investigation involving the dark web criminal network called Silk Road. And really, I started this series with my villain, strangely enough, rather than my protagonist, because in Black Nowhere, the book is a fictionalized version of the story of Ross Ulbricht. And I was so fascinated by him because he was this smart, young, tech-savvy college student who started this online platform, and much like a lot of tech entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley, but it turned into this enormous criminal enterprise where a large portion of the illegal drug trade in the U.S. was being distributed through this dark web network that he established. And so I thought it was fascinating to sort of watch his, transformation from this idealistic kid with these sort of libertarian ideas into a criminal kingpin who was ordering hits on people who were, threatening to expose him to law enforcement. So I thought what was so fascinating about that story of Silk Road was that I thought it paralleled so many Silicon Valley success stories. It just happened to be the rise and fall of a tech startup that was also a criminal enterprise. So and then I needed a worthy adversary for that character called Nate Fallon in my book, and that's when I started developing Lisa Tanchik, who sort of stood in the place of a number of real-life investigators who helped to bring down Ross Ulbricht. But I needed somebody just as smart and interesting as he was, and hopefully I got there with Lisa.
It is time to go ahead and take our first break of the podcast, but something that struck me during this interview, and it's struck me at various points before, but have you noticed, if you're a regular listener of the podcast, how many authors that I talk to who are either lawyers or journalists, sometimes both. It just seems to be those two professions tend to, I don't know, funnel or segue into being an author pretty seamlessly or something. So I don't know. I find that fascinating. Just thought I'd throw that out there. We are going to take that break. When we come back, Reece will be talking more about Lisa as the main character. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Golden State Media Concepts bring you the Bible Study Podcast. Reflect and journey the Bible as together we study God's Word and be inspired. Bible study made fun and informative for all ages. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Bible Study Podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking today with author Reece Hirsch about his novel, Dark Tomorrow. Let's go ahead and return to that interview.
Yeah, and so talk a little bit more about Lisa. What about her do you think will resonate with readers?
Well, I think that she's a little bit of a misfit and a little bit of an underdog, which I think readers always find appealing. And I think when I started writing the character, I was imagining what it might be like to be a cyber crimes investigator in the FBI, because, like a lot of cyber experts, she doesn't fit the mold of a traditional, square-jawed FBI agent. And, I think that she has to, she doesn't have the sort of the field skills that most FBI special agents would have. She's better at the keyboard than at, handling a gun and bringing down, a suspect in the field. But so maybe she's a little underestimated at the start of the book, but it turns out that her online skills end up being, extremely valuable in dealing with the kind of criminal that they're facing with Nate Fallon and this dark web network. And she also has another, sort of complication in that she suffers from clinical depression. And so that sort of colors, a lot of her personality, but it doesn't hold her back, doesn't keep her from doing her job, but it definitely creates difficulties for her in her personal life.
Mm-hmm. And actually, that's an aspect of her character that I wanted to ask you about. Did that sort of develop just naturally out of her character, or was that a deliberate choice on your part to include that in her character, maybe to highlight mental health?
Well, I wasn't setting out to sort of send a message about mental health, but I see these issues all around me and the people I know, like most of us do, and I just felt like that had been underrepresented in fiction, and so I thought it would be interesting to explore that, because so the typical genre trope is an alcoholic, private eye or lawyer or whatever, and that's been done many, many times and very, very well. But I could think of fewer examples of protagonists who were dealing with depression in a way that was compelling. So I thought I'd explore that.
All right, thank you. What type of research did you do for the book?
Well, I'm a privacy and cybersecurity lawyer, so I do sort of deal in this world, but not so much the law enforcement side of it. But I frequently represent companies that are experiencing security breaches, that may be victims of state-sponsored hackers or ransomware attacks, that sort of thing. So I knew this world, a fair amount, but I really didn't know as much about cyber warfare and the efforts that agencies like U.S. Cyber Command engage in to defend against those attacks. So, a lot of that's very confidential stuff. So there's only so much, available in the public domain. But there were a few really good books, and particularly The Perfect Weapon by David Sanger of the New York Times was a very recent book that kind of has state-of-the-art, up-to-date information on kind of the nature of cyber warfare and its history. And there was another book called Dark Territory by Fred Kaplan, which is also known as The Secret History of Cyber War. So I did pretty extensive reading about the nature of cyber warfare. And frankly, it was I knew I was scared about regarding the subject, but now I'm much more scared because it turns out that we're extremely vulnerable, and cyber warfare is something that occurs every day between nations. It just hasn't flared up into a major all-out conflict. It's just other countries sort of testing one another, and I thought my book turned out to be particularly timely because at the time I was writing it, I didn't learn about it until it hit the press later, but Russia was actually perpetrating the SolarWinds hack on the U.S. government agencies, and that's very similar to the attack that I write about in Dark Tomorrow. The main difference is that in my book, the adversary really exploits that information and goes all out rather than just penetrating networks and gathering information. Because in my book, the power grid and the entire east coast of the United States is taken out, and many different systems, hospitals, nuclear power plants, various systems are all crashed, and so the country's thrown into chaos. And obviously that hasn't happened, but it very easily could.
Mm-hmm. And it's always fascinating to me how books can be timely because, writing a book, it takes a while. And then the publishing process, et cetera, even whether it's self-published or published through more traditional means, it's fascinating how timely a book can be, even if it's written, 2 years ago, and still you feel like it's current with things that are happening now.
Right. Yeah, and a lot of my books involve kind of looking just over the horizon at issues that are coming, and some of the older ones are still very timely because I wrote one book called Intrusion, which is about Chinese state-sponsored hackers stealing the intellectual property of U.S. companies, and that's still very much in the news and happening.
Mm-hmm. And then how about character development? Do you have a pretty good idea about the characters before you start writing, or does that tend to evolve more as you write?
Well, I guess that's the one nice thing about writing Dark Tomorrow is the second book in a series, because I had already sort of laid the groundwork for Lisa Tanchik, and I knew that character, but the second book allowed me to dig a little deeper and explore different facets of her personality. But when I'm writing the first book in a series, I do spend a lot of time on those early chapters, sort of testing the waters with the new character, and sometimes it takes a little while before that character starts to feel like it's coming to life and sort of speaking with his or her own voice. I think that I try writing character sketches and sort of making a profile of who I think the character is. But inevitably, once you actually start writing and putting that character into situations, you start to really get a sense for who they are. Hopefully they kind of come to life a little bit and start to live and breathe and hopefully surprise you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly with the surprise you do. Have you ever had a character, even a secondary character, just completely go in a direction you weren't expecting?
Yeah, well, I've had certain characters, sometimes minor characters, who I'm surprised that they sort of take on a life of their own. And some people say, I want a whole book about this guy. He's so interesting. And I thought, oh, really? That was kind of a throwaway character, but it's often unpredictable how people are going to respond to certain things.
Right.
Right. But and I think that in writing Black Nowhere in particular, I was surprised by Ross Ulbricht and the character I wrote about him, Nate Fallon, because all through the book, I wanted the reader to be a little uncertain whether he was a bad guy or a good guy. I wanted them to sympathize with him, even though he's doing bad things. And I think that was a character that I really had fun with and also struggled with, because I knew there was going to come a point where he was going to do something that was going to be irredeemable, that was going to cross the line for the reader. And yet, even then, I still wanted the readers to see the humanity in him and feel sympathy for him at the end. So that was a particularly interesting character arc to work on.
Mm-hmm.
Time for the second break of the podcast. When we come back, Reece will be talking about any autobiographical elements that he tends to include in his writing. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be, visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my interview with author Reece Hirsch. We are talking about his newest novel, Dark Tomorrow. Let's return to the interview.
I know that you draw on your own work in this field of cybersecurity, but are there particular autobiographical elements within your writing in terms of settings or characters, anything like that?
Well, quite a few of my books are set in the Bay Area, and that's where I live and work. And also, I've written sort of 4 books with lawyer protagonists. I think my first book, like a lot of first books, was probably maybe the most autobiographical. It was called The Insider, and it was sort of a John Grisham-esque legal thriller, and about a young, a corporate attorney in a San Francisco law firm, trying to make partner. And when I was writing that, it was around the time that I was making partner in a big San Francisco law firm. And of course, with my character, Will Connolly, in that book, as soon as he makes partner, his whole life goes to hell in a lot of ways. But and my life did not follow that arc, fortunately. But But I think in writing about law firms, I was definitely drawing on my personal experience. And then I wrote a series of 3 books with the character of Chris Bruin, who's a former Department of Justice cyber crimes prosecutor who's been working in private practice in a San Francisco law firm. And even though my legal practice is still fairly different from Chris's, that was also autobiographical to a certain extent.
Mm-hmm. You made me laugh when you said that after the one character gets the partnership, his life kind of goes to hell, and yours did not, thankfully. But think of that the book would have been fairly mundane had his life just gone along with nothing happening. Authors tend to need to make terrible things happen to their characters to move the story forward.
That's true. I had to bring Russian mobsters into his life and threaten. Yeah, and it's like the Chris Bruin series. Reading that, you would think that being a privacy lawyer is the most dangerous occupation on the planet. But Chris's life is often threatened. But fortunately, mine. Even though I deal with some very scary and dramatic situations, I am rarely in personal peril.
Well, I am glad for you on that account. This is the second book that features Lisa. Do you have more planned for her character, or will it just be a duology?
Right now, it's just the 2. I would love to come back to that character at some point, but I'm trying something a little different with the book I'm currently working on. For the first time, I'm sort of moving away from the privacy and cybersecurity area and writing a psychological suspense novel, and sort of coming down the home stretch and writing that one. It's been a lot of fun.
All right, that actually was my follow-up question of what are you working on now? Do you have a title for that work in progress? Do you have an idea when it might be published?
Well, I don't have a publication date yet for it. I'm going to turn it into my agent in a couple months, and then he's going to try to get me a new book deal because I completed the deal I was under, and the working title for it is Our Murder Story. So, and it's sort of my version of a locked room mystery because it's set in a very unusual place where people are very isolated. I don't want to say a lot about it. It's still very much a work in progress, but but I've been having a lot of fun with it. It's a very different sort of book, although it still has a body count and suspense, and but no cybercrime.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. When did you decide that you wanted to try to start writing fiction and try to write for publication?
Well, I always wanted to do it, and I went to journalism school at Northwestern and worked as a journalist for a few years. And when I did that, I always told myself that sort of being a novelist was a hard road, and being a journalist was a more practical way to guarantee I would make a living while still writing. And so I kept saying I was going to do it. Then I went to law school, and I was very, very busy as a young associate and struggling to make partners. So it took me a while to really get down to business and writing a manuscript. But finally I did it sort of after I made partner, after I turned 40, and really got started when I took a novel writing workshop, an extension course at UC Berkeley. I know you have a Berkeley connection, right?
I do. I went to grad school in Berkeley, not at Berkeley, but in Berkeley. I know that sounds weird. So go ahead.
Well, that workshop sort of got me started. It gave me a little discipline, and I started putting the pages together for the book that ultimately became The Insider. And it was really helpful to to get feedback and to get a reaction from readers, even if it's just the members of my writing group.
Mm-hmm. So from that experience, do you have advice for aspiring authors?
I think I would encourage them to start sooner than I did, and just there's no substitute for developing a habit of writing every day, even if it's just a little bit. Because I certainly have a demanding schedule, as a partner in a big law firm. But I find that if I can just get a little bit done every day, it ultimately turns into a book. And I think the important thing is just to keep those pages going, and also to not get discouraged, because there's inevitably, unless you're very, very lucky, there's a lot of rejection in the early days, both in first trying to find an agent and then trying to get a publishing deal. So nobody gets there without having a fairly thick skin and being willing to put up with some rejection.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. When you take the time to read for yourself, what are your favorite genres? Who are your favorite go-to authors?
Well, I do enjoy, mystery and crime fiction, as you would expect. I like authors like Richard Price and Dennis Lehane and Robert Stone and Don Winslow and Megan Abbott, Kate Atkinson. But I also read, other, sort of more literary fiction too. Although I hate to even make the distinction between literary and genre fiction. I think some of the best writers working today are writing, mysteries and crime novels. But I enjoyed Normal People by Sally Rooney, even though that's, very, very much outside of my normal wheelhouse. And Sean Cosby is doing great work these days with I love Blacktop Wasteland.
Time for the last break of the podcast. When we come back, we'll be wrapping things up with where you can find Reece's website, social media, all of those wonderful things. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the backdoors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion of my interview with author Reece Hirsch.
Let's see. I know you have a website, so if you can share the web address as well as where social media platforms that you are active on.
Sure. I'm on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Don't use that too much, though. And my website is reecehirsch.com, ReeceHirsch.com. So I'm not the most active writer on social media, but I am there.
All right. Well, thank you for that. And Reece, we've talked about the book. We've talked about Dark Tomorrow and Lisa. But are there anything that we haven't covered that you were hoping to highlight during our time together?
Well, I guess I would just like to say that some people think that that books that deal with privacy and cybersecurity are going to be too technical for them. But I definitely strive to make these high-tech concepts very simple and readable, and ultimately they're all just page turners. And so the comment I often get from readers is, "Oh, gee, I thought this would be really technical and hard to understand, but it was a lot of fun." And that's what my goal is to take some of these cutting edge and sometimes very scary trends in technology and turn them into entertaining page turners. So that's what I write.
Yeah, and I would say it's not like a technical slog as you're reading through it. It's definitely a page turner, but also don't worry about the technical aspects. Worry about just being scared to ever go online again.
That's right. If I scare you a little bit about the internet and technology, then I've done my job. And that's sort of a theme in my books. That little stencil that's on mirrors. Objects are closer than they appear. Well, that's the kind of fear that I deal with in my books, because even though technology is great and it brings us closer together, it also brings a lot of bad people close to us as well, as close as our inbox. And so, that's something that and with government surveillance and, malware and ransomware and, all these new threats, that's kind of my bread and butter, sort of that fear that you're always being watched, or you're one click away of dealing with somebody who's a very bad person who means you harm.
Yes. I was just trying to think of how that could be translated into a Halloween costume. That is something very scary right now.
I'm going to have to give that some thought. There's got to be a Halloween costume there somewhere.
There does. I'm not that creative. I'm not coming up with anything, but there's got to be something. Reece, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. It's great talking to you, and thanks a lot.
Thank you once again to Reece for taking the time to talk to me about Dark Tomorrow and Lisa Tanchik and some of his other writings. If you are a fan of thrillers, of cybercrime, if you're a fan of cybercrime, you know what I mean. If you're a fan of books that delve into cybercrime and this type of mystery, then you should definitely check out Dark Tomorrow, as well as the first book that features Special Agent Lisa Tanchik. That one is called Black Nowhere. So Black Nowhere and then Dark Tomorrow are the two novels featuring Lisa. And you should definitely check this one out. Put it on your TBR if you are a fan of this type of thriller, this type of crime fiction. Again, two weeks in a row, or 2 interviews in a row, we've got strong, kind of kick-ass women solving mysteries, so you can't go wrong with that. Actually, 3 interviews in a row. We have another interview, another book featuring a woman PI. Coming up on the next interview, when I will be speaking with author Mary Kelly Ikoa about her book Denied. It is the second book in her Kelly Pruitt series, and so we'll be talking about that. Once again, we have a female PI, a mystery, so join me on Tuesday's podcast for that interview. In the meantime, I hope that you will do me the favor, the honor of writing or leaving a starred review for this podcast if you have not already done so. I always say it, but it really does help us to get this podcast out to more people who love books. So it would be great if you could help me in that way. Also, if you're not following on social media, please do so. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. I love hearing from listeners. I love interacting with listeners. Hit me up with questions. Tell me what you're reading. Tell me if you're going to ever finish your TBR in this or any other lifetime. I love to hear from listeners. So thank you once again. I hope that you have, again, something fun planned for this weekend. If it's going to rain like it is here, then I hope that you can just stay inside, snuggle up with a blanket and a cup of your favorite hot beverage, and then get lost in a good book. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast. part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.